Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at the lodgepole pine, or scientific name Pinus contorta, I think. Anyway, so this is a very common tree in the Rocky Mountains, foothills, in through the Columbia Mountains, even up to the coast ranges, the eastern slopes of the coast ranges in BC. Goes well into the US, all the way through to the Yukon. So what makes this tree kind of special? It's called the lodgepole pine. It's very common, fast grower, and as the name suggests, it makes its straight, long, kind of thin trunk makes for good, I guess, structural supports and teepees and that sort of thing, and got its name lodgepole from that, the common name. So here, this is kind of a heavily disturbed area. Behind me was a clear cut, and this has been subject to a heavy kind of wind blow. So, but it kind of serves a purpose here for our video. Here we have the needles of the lodgepole. This is a 2 needle grouping. So just let me grab a hold of one here. You can see that the needles are in 2 groups, or sorry, groups of 2. It's the only pine in the Rocky Mountain ecosystem that has a 2 needle group, although it's commonly confused with the jack pine, which is kind of a boreal species that doesn't occur in this region. However, where they do overlap, they can hybridize. It also is a 2 needle pine. But one of the main differences you can see, we have a female cone here, and you can see that this cone is pointed towards the trunk of the tree. The jack pine, the female cones point away from the tree, and often the jack pine cones are have more of a curvature to them. So kind of an interesting way to help identify the 2 species. So we have the male cones at the end of the branches producing pollen for the female cones here. These cones are sealed with a waxy substance, and that substance is designed to melt somewhere, I think, in the range of 45 degrees Celsius, or maybe a little more. And once it's melted, the cones open, and the reason for that is you know, they evolved with a common forest fire disturbance. So as the cones are on the ground, the kind of the sparse undergrowth where these pines like to grow, it's a little drier here. They like well-drained soil in general. This kind of grassy undergrowth would burn fairly quickly and not necessarily damage the parent tree. You can see here the bark is very scaly. It'll flake off very easily. It's kind of a gray color, but what I have noticed, and I'll show an example of this, is that the southeast side, I don't know why, in this area anyway, why southeast, can have a reddish hue, and I will definitely show that as well. This example here, we have a lot of the lower branches have died, and the reason is the lodgepole needles are not tolerant of shade. So any kind of shade on them will cause them to die eventually. So what we're going to do is kind of take a look, because this is one of those species that is kind of a pioneering species where after a fire, after a disturbance like a fire or a clear cut, they are among the first to to grow back. So we have here on this side a clear cut, and it's not very old. Maybe it was cut 9 or 10 years ago or less. I apologize, my dogs are running around. Anyway, we have some young lodgepole kind of coming out of the grass here, and these were either planted by the logging company or grew up from the seed bank that's already in the soil. These lodgepole are favored by a lot of timber companies for replanting because it grows quickly and it's a valuable species. Across the valley, you can actually see part of a regrowth in an older clear cut. So this one will take a few years to get to that stage, and what we'll do is we'll kind of go through some of the growth stages here. So we have the early stage here, where, as you can see, some very small pines growing up, and we'll go into kind of more of an intermediate stage like you see across the valley, and then we'll go into a more mature phase. Okay, so here's kind of the next phase of growth from a clear cut. This area would have been cut, you know, maybe 20 years ago, somewhere or less, somewhere in that range. And you can see that it's very dense. The trees are starting to kind of separate from each other, where you see, like, for instance, this one on the left here, put my finger in the way right there, is a little bit taller than some of these, and we just are starting to get moving towards from this what some people call a dog hair type forest. This is a even age, very dense forest of young lodgepole. So we're moving now towards a more mature lodgepole forest, where you see we have some weaker trees, like some of these shorter ones, a little bit thinner, that will eventually die out, leave a little more space for the other ones to grow into a little more mature trees. And you can see a lot of that is happening here. We have some small dead trees. Kind of how the succession works is the way the weaker trees weed themselves out with snow load, this type of thing, similar to what happens in a kind of a pure aspen stand as they kind of weed each other out. They're both, aspen and lodgepole can be kind of pioneer species. This particular area, I don't know if it was planted. I don't think necessarily it was, due to the density of it. What you get, in a mature forest is the thousands and thousands and thousands of cones on the ground, producing millions of seeds. So I guess they evolved to open those cones. The wax coating opens during a fire or a low fire, or in a logging event, the old cones open and the seeds stay in the soil for many years, and we get something like this, where when the sun hits the ground, they germinate, and we get something as dense as this. So this area dominant on the undergrowth side. It's mostly grasses, so would be certainly subject to forest fire risk. Generally, with all this low branches and things like that, a grass fire would turn into something a little bit bigger, because there's so much fuel here. So once all this is cleared out, maybe rotted or that type of thing, the lodgepole can be somewhat fire resistant to kind of a low intensity ground fire. But you can see that as this grass dries out in the fall or in late summer, it certainly would be subject to burning. So yeah, so this is kind of the midlife of a lodgepole stand. Okay, so here's a good example of the transition between that clear-cut area we were just in and then the more mature lodgepole forest as we go through this direction here. So there's a lot bigger spacing between trees. There's a lot of deadwood on the ground from the thinning of the stand, the natural thinning of the stand. And the biggest thing is the amount of light that reaches the ground. This area is south facing, well drained as lodgepole prefers, and quite dry. Even in the winter, it does not hold a lot of snow. It would melt off pretty quick. So we're gonna kind of head into the more mature forest and kind of look at some of those features. Okay, we have a pretty open section here. We have some young trees popping up here in these kind of sunny little meadows. For undergrowth in this type of area, we have common juniper. They like the kind of a similar habitat, sunny, well drained. We also have a lot of bearberry. Right here you can see the small green leaves there and the berries that are just forming. And of course all the lodgepole pine here. I'm going to make my way over to one here where we can kind of see that reddish bark coloration. And this tree, this is on kind of a easterly, southeasterly facing direction. It gets a lot of sun here, and I think that this coloration has something to do with the amount of sun that it gets. But you can see that we have that definite color difference from this side of the tree around to that grayish scale on this side. So kind of an interesting feature of the lodgepole pine. This forest here, we have a lot of downed wood and dry kind of wood, and you can see the amount of cones that are on these trees. Sometimes at the top of these trees there can be thousands of cones on every tree. So that's why we get such a large grow back you know, after a disturbance like a fire. So okay, so we'll continue on to a little more dense area of pine. Oh, one kind of feature of these open areas, I found that the trees don't necessarily get quite as tall. They do get fairly wide in the trunk, but without the competition for light, there's not as much need to grow so tall. The lodgepole pine can be up to at least 40 meters in height, which is quite a tall tree in this area. But in these open areas, I find that they're in that 40 to 50 foot range more often than not. So we'll go into an area where they're a little bit taller, a little denser now. Okay, here's a couple of things I wanted to mention about the cones here. Another kind of differentiator between the lodgepole and the jack pine is, I'm just going to grab this and put it in my hand here. The jack pine, if I can get it to focus, there we maybe it was better there. So the jack pine doesn't have as prominent kind of spikes as the lodgepole cone does. The lodgepole cone is kind of uncomfortable to squeeze in your hand. It's quite sharp. This is a young cone, has not opened. I'm not really sure if the seeds have matured yet in there. And then beside it we have kind of an older cone where, not in a fire, but this one has actually opened and released its seeds. So kind of an interesting look at the kind of the life of the cones as well. As you can see, the ground anywhere where lodgepole pine grow is littered with old cones, and it creates quite a seed bank for the, in the event of kind of a large disturbance. One other thing to point out, from what my understanding is, lodgepole pine can live up to 300 years, or maybe even 400. So I don't think that's terribly common, especially in areas like this. This is a kind of foothills region where fire would be more frequent, much more frequent than that. The lodgepole pine that we're going to look at in the next scene there is somewhere in the range of 70, 80 years old, and it's already kind of at the end of its life cycle in the forest, or towards the end. So anyway, we'll take a look at that. Okay, so here we are in, I guess, kind of the final stages of the lodgepole pine forest, and this these specimens here are quite tall, probably over 30 meters, or somewhere in that thereabouts, somewhere maybe 85 to 95 feet high. They're fairly old. The trunk diameters at the bottom are somewhere in the 18, I guess 15 to 18 inch range, somewhere like that. However, so there's a lot of white spruce, there's some aspen, and kind of a mixed bag here. But these trees, once they get into this stage where there's mature white spruce and the forest floor is quite shady, the likelihood without a disturbance of them kind of regenerating gets lower and lower. So once these die, they'll likely be replaced with spruce, fir, that kind of thing, and unless like kind of a major disturbance comes through, you're going to see less and less pine in an area like this. So I guess kind of we've gone through kind of all the phases, the start and the kind of early lives, and the medium, in that forest, the more open area, and where it becomes a little more closed off, and the shade tolerant trees have caught kind of the lodgepoles and will eventually shade them out. So there we go. I guess we'll end the video there, and hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks.